Real fights in pro wrestling, Big Van Vader and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. In 1995, Big Van Vader was still on top of his game, still prominently featured in WCW, and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff was in the twilight of his career. He was working as an agent, as a producer, and had atrophied in one arm due to a severe neck injury that wasn't properly taken care of. However, Big Van Vader still felt the wrath of Mr. Wonderful. He had been procrastinating on interviews for quite some time, and Paul Orndorff got in his face about it, supposedly within 3 or 4 inches. Vader, depending on who you hear from, slapped him, which was maybe a sucker punch, and Paul Orndorff unleashed. Big Van Vader claimed that he allowed it to happen, but Orndorff kicked and punched him so many times while wearing shower shoes that apparently he injured his own foot. Vader would be gone from WCW shortly after that, and Mr. Wonderful would make sporadic appearances here and there. Real fights in pro wrestling, Bill Goldberg versus Evan Courageous. Back in WCW, Bill Goldberg and Evan Courageous were on different parts of the card, but the former WCW champion Goldberg and 3 counts Evan Courageous were at least on cordial terms for a little bit, to the point to where Bill Goldberg went up and extended his hand for a handshake to Courageous. However, Courageous had noticed Goldberg had been shaking something else. His own nuts! Courageous saw that he had been fondling himself before offering the handshake, and Courageous balked at the attempt. This supposedly set Bill Goldberg into a fit of rage, causing him to grab Courageous by the throat and throw him over a barricade, as recited by the Insane Clown Posse. When Courageous approached the ICP and asked if he should sue Goldberg, they just changed their story and said that they didn't see anything. Real fights in pro wrestling, Brock Lesnar versus Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig. On the infamous plane ride from hell when Brock Lesnar was just a rookie, future UFC champion Lesnar and Mr. Perfect got into it. There's plenty of stories of this plane ride, but this one had people nearby fearing for their safety. Hennig was supposedly very intoxicated and repeatedly challenged Lesnar to try and take him down to test his amateur wrestling credentials. Lesnar wasn't sure what to really do, and Paul Heyman apparently told Brock Lesnar that he had to shut Mr. Perfect up or he would never hear the end of it. So Brock Lesnar jumped up, dove into Curt Hennig and into the plane door, nearly ripping it clear off of its hinges and putting everybody at danger. The fight was broken up by management. Brock Lesnar would go on to be atop the WWE. Mr. Perfect would be fired and never return to WWE again. Real fights in pro wrestling, Excalibur versus Jimmy Havoc. Excalibur is best known as AEW's play-by-play commentator, but in 2019 he put a beating down on Jimmy Havoc. Many of the wrestlers' staff and security were at Jimmy's famous seafood in Baltimore, Maryland, when an intoxicated brawl broke out. Intoxicated on the behalf of Jimmy Havoc, who got belligerent and tried to throw a punch at Excalibur. It missed, and Excalibur proceeded to choke Jimmy Havoc out until security broke up the melee. Jimmy Havoc tried to throw another couple of punches after everything was calmed down and was kicked out. Outside, Excalibur, with a cool head, tried to patch things up. Jimmy Havoc wasn't having it, threw his phone, missed again, and it smashed up against the wall. The two made up eventually, but Jimmy Havoc was fired due to disciplinary reasons the next year as his name emerged in speaking out allegations. Real fights in pro wrestling, JBL versus Joey Styles? Former WWE champion JBL has long been a heat seeker in pro wrestling, to the point to where numerous talent and backstage workers told Fightful during a Brawl for All feature that he's the reason the Brawl for All was created because so many people wanted to shut him up. In 2008, one WWE announcer got the chance. Joey Styles, who worked on the ECW and Raw brands as a play-by-play announcer, had been getting disrespected by JBL throughout the tour, called names, and apparently had a drink intentionally spilled on him. Joey Styles had enough, reared back, and cracked JBL in the face before a bunch of wrestlers supposedly broke it up. JBL has never spoken about this and allegedly went to his hotel room and stayed there the rest of the night. Neither man were punished, and supposedly Joey Styles even got some respect from Vince McMahon for standing up for himself. Real fights in pro wrestling, Kurt Angle versus Daniel Puder. In 2004, Tough Enough had moved from a standalone reality show to a segment on SmackDown, and one of those segments featured Kurt Angle out-wrestling a cast member. Kurt Angle, who was far removed from his gold medal wrestling days, had been battling severe injuries that hampered him and kept him from even doing 10 push-ups at a time, according to his own word. However, afterwards, he volunteered to wrestle any other member of the cast. Daniel Puder, an undefeated heavyweight MMA fighter who would go on to win Tough Enough, volunteered. He quickly applied a double wrist lock, also known as a Kimura, and the ref, knowing the situation that Kurt Angle was in, quickly counted the 3, which is allowed in pro wrestling, isn't in MMA. Kurt Angle got in Daniel Puder's face after the situation, and there was never really any follow-up. Daniel Puder would be out of WWE very, very shortly, and Kurt Angle would move on to TNA. Real fights in pro wrestling, Shawn Michaels and Bret the Hitman Hart. One of the most legendary and controversial feuds on screen was also one of the most controversial off the screen. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels had worked together for years, including main eventing WrestleMania 12 in 1996, but by June 97, things had really devolved. The two had choice words for each other on the screen, had accused one another of undermining each other, and things came to blows in June 1997. A fight took place backstage in which Jerry Lawler was nearby. They ended up taking down Pat Patterson in the fray, and Shawn Michaels ended up having clumps of his hair ripped out. Just 5 months later, the Montreal Screwjob would happen, which changed the course of wrestling history forever. Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart did not see eye to eye for years after that. Real fights in pro wrestling, Ultimate Warrior versus Ravishing Rick Rude. Ravishing Rick Rude was a very integral part of Ultimate Warrior's ascent to the top of WWE. However, Ultimate Warrior didn't always seem so gracious for that. Ultimate Warrior was long known as a wrestler who was perhaps reckless in the ring, dangerous, and would lay in his strikes even when it wasn't necessarily needed. Rick Rude in 1989 had enough of this, went to Ultimate Warrior and said, "Hey, maybe lighten up." Ultimate Warrior's response? "I don't have to, I'm Ultimate Warrior." Rick Rude responded by punching Ultimate Warrior in the face, putting him flat on his back, and neither man was ever punished for the situation. Real fights in pro wrestling, Antonio Inoki versus the Great Antonio. Well, on this day, the Great Antonio was certainly not that great. During a match with the legendary Antonio Inoki in New Japan in 1977, the Great Antonio began mocking the Japanese legend, even no-selling several of his strikes. He threw several stiff ones himself, definitely intending to inflict damage. That didn't happen. It only served to piss Antonio Inoki off. Antonio Inoki struck back, then waved at Great Antonio to continue to bring it. He shot a single leg takedown, dragged the much larger Great Antonio to the mat before punting him in the head repeatedly, leaving the Great Antonio in a bloody heap on the mat. The Great Antonio would never wrestle again, and Antonio Inoki would go on to be one of the most legendary figures in wrestling history. Real fights in pro wrestling, Big Show Paul White versus the Great Khali. Giants in pro wrestling are naturally matched up with one another, but they don't always get along, as was the case with Big Show and Great Khali. Rumor goes that the two had heat for quite a while, and then during a show, Great Khali did one of Big Show's signature moves. He chopped to the chest following a shh. Big Show didn't take too well with this and confronted Great Khali about it backstage. Tempers flared and Big Show would throw a punch, but would eventually trip on a chair and end up losing the fight as a result. Afterwards, the two met with Vince McMahon. Big Show was made to apologize for throwing the first punch. He would later admit, via Chris Jericho, that he had lost the fight. Great Khali claimed that the man wept. Real fights in pro wrestling, Brock Lesnar and Braun Strowman. Back during Brock Lesnar's WWE Universal title reign, he was booked into a triple threat match with the surging Braun Strowman and the legendary former WWF champion, Kane. Very early in the match, Braun Strowman threw a knee to the side of the head of Brock Lesnar. He was certainly overzealous as it connected heavily, and the former UFC champion Brock Lesnar was not happy about it. He quickly returned with a huge uppercut that staggered Braun Strowman, and then followed up with a straight right hand to the left side of Braun Strowman's head that rocked Strowman. Fortunately, Strowman was not knocked out by the punch, but Brock Lesnar certainly sent a message. I think we would call that more of a receipt than an actual fight. Real fights in pro wrestling, JBL versus the Lethal Weapon, Steve Blackman. JBL was long known as an instigator backstage in WWE, and unfortunately for him, he instigated with Steve Blackman on an early morning flight. JBL repeatedly patted Steve Blackman on the ass, who warned him numerous times to stop. JBL did not oblige and was met with a backhand to the face. JBL would miss a series of punches and then catch a barrage of kicks from Steve Blackman. As legend tells, Steve Blackman caught his leg on a bag, and otherwise it would have been lights out for JBL and his knee. JBL acted like he wanted to continue to fight, so Steve Blackman went to look for him later and said, "If you've got something to say to me, go ahead and say it." And JBL fessed up and said, "You know what? I probably shouldn't have messed with you." Later on, JBL said that he lost a fight before he even knew that he was in one. Real fights in pro wrestling, Ken Shamrock versus JBL. If you've watched this series before, you know the drill. JBL's getting beat up. He was talking that trash, and according to Bruce Pritchard on his podcast, it didn't work out well for him against Ken Shamrock. Ken Shamrock got tired of JBL running his mouth and said, "You know what? I'll just let you put me in a hold. Any hold you want, and I'll still beat you." JBL says, "Well, I don't want to hurt you, man." So Ken Shamrock gets down, allows JBL to put a hold on until JBL realizes he doesn't know any holds. So Ken Shamrock teaches JBL how to put on an armbar, allows him to apply it, still gets out of it, and taps out JBL in under 1 minute. Some people never learn. Real fights in pro wrestling, Nia Jax and Charlotte Flair. In September 2021, Nia Jax and Charlotte Flair were featured in a match on WWE Monday Night Raw. Things got a little bit chippy inside the ring. Charlotte Flair ended up throwing some stiff strikes at Nia Jax. Nia Jax would throw her hands out, look at Charlotte Flair, and deliver a completely untelegraphed two-piece that would rock the legendary women's champion Charlotte. Charlotte wouldn't hesitate to throw some stiff strikes back. However, the match ended fine. They get backstage, they talked it out, they spent some time away from each other and decided there was simply a miscommunication. Charlotte would later say that her friends hit her harder and vice versa, and that they're still close friends. Nia Jax would back this up, saying that they're still close and it was simply a miscommunication. Real fights in pro wrestling, Cara and Sheamus. Now, there's a lot of versions of Sin Cara, Mystico, all of the above, but the version that we're talking about is the one that was the former Hunico and then took over the Sin Cara mask. Supposedly in 2014, he had an issue with one of Sheamus's friends for perceiving that this person was too good to shake everybody's hand backstage. Allegedly, Sheamus approached Hunico, Sin Cara, backstage on the trainer's table and told him to get up because he was more important and needed treatment. Sheamus would later tell people that this was a joke, but Sin Cara did not like this and stood up to Sheamus. Now, the legend goes that Sheamus threw the first punch, but Sin Cara did a bit of a leg sweep, followed up, and it was broken up. We'll never really know exactly how these fights went. We did speak to Sin Cara about them briefly, but he did admit that he had to go to anger management classes after his plethora of fights in WWE.